Hello, everyone. Welcome to my vlog. Today I have a special guest. This is my father. Um, so I'm glad I got him on the show. And let's see. I was gonna talk because this is my show, and I usually talk about writing and that sort of thing. Dad's not a writer; he's a scientist. Um,
Not even remotely a writer.
yes. However, you have written some scientific journals, and you have written a thesis for your PhD. So
Yes.
you've
Uh,
done some writing.
yes, I published maybe 30 papers or so, scientific papers.
Wow. Okay. I mean, and you've been published in multiple languages and in journals across the world. Is that right?
Most of it's in English, but they've been in British journals, American journals, some in German journals. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And what was your PhD thesis in?
My PhD thesis was on it was about the Donnan potential in biological systems and cells. It's kind of a electrochemistry, a cross between electrochemistry and biophysics. I mean, my PhD's in biophysics.
Wow. Okay. And I mean, and I know that you were one of the co-founders of a company that made the MRI,
Yeah.
magnetic resonance imaging. And so that, that's very much being an entrepreneur. And that's sort of what I'm doing as a self-published author. Of course, that's a totally different field and a totally different time period. Um, but I'd like to hear more about that. And I mean,
Well, that was back in the 1970s. It was economically a very different world than it is today.
yeah, yeah, I'm sure. Um, so my dad's told me that when he was working on the MRI, the like the startup funding that they got was something like $1 million. Or
Well, when we formed the company to manufacture, to develop and manufacture MRIs, we raised $1 million at first from private investors in the first efforts. And today, to do the same thing, that number would have to be easily 50 or 100 million.
wow, yeah, yeah. So very different world. Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, of course. I don't know. I mean, let's see. So now there's things like Kickstarter and there's crowdfunding, and they didn't have that back then. But you probably couldn't do that for the medical industry, I would assume. I mean,
Well, I mean, your initial stage funding you could get from any sources. In fact, some of the people who eventually became investors initially were funding our research as a charity while
wow.
we were still at a medical institution because um, we were originally operating with some government grants, and when the grant money ran out, we would have had to stop the research. But some dedicated individuals who were wealthy and had an interest in the research and in seeing medicine advance um, continued to fund us so that we could continue it. Eventually, they suggested that we form a company and take it private so there'd be a return on all of that, and that's what we did.
Wow. So, I mean, did you ever have doubts? Well, I mean, how long did it take, first of all, from the initial start to you knew it was a sure thing? It was, you had an MRI.
Well, I mean, we made the first human image of very primitive image in 1976, and in the summer of 1976. In fact, what's memorable about it to me is that it was on my first wedding anniversary about 3 o'clock in the morning that we made that image.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Did it interrupt the wedding anniversary?
we didn't have much of a celebration that night, no.
Okay. Um, wow. So, um, hmm.
But how long was it? So we started the research. You know, it was just an evolving process, really. It really evolved from research we were doing in the late 1960s. It became focused on MRI imaging in the early 1970s, and it was just, there was never any certainty that it could be done. It just was kind of a let's try this and see how far we can get, and we moved along. We did small. Originally, of course, in the early days, you were dealing with very, very small samples, maybe a quarter of an inch by a quarter of an inch in every dimension. That was what was doable in most chemistry labs in the 1960s in magnetic resonance. And we thought it could be probably scaled up to the size of a human. A lot of people laughed at the idea that you could build a magnet big enough to put a person in and do this. And certainly the key person, the head of our lab, Raymond Domain, he took a lot of flack from his colleagues over that.
But you thought it was possible, obviously. I mean,
obviously, I thought I had an open mind about it. I thought it was possibly doable. I didn't see any reason why it wasn't. It was plausible to me, and so we set about doing it. And it was a largely trial and error initially. We just it was pretty easy to scale up things to a sample of about 5 inches diameter. And then we started running into problems design problems in what I was working on was the electronics and the antenna system. And once you got above diameters of 5 inches, you started to have effects that we didn't anticipate that complicated things. But eventually, with a lot of trial and error, and we were able to scale that up, and we had to build our own magnet, superconducting magnet, to generate a magnetic field over such a large diameter object. And that magnet, let's see, as I recall, Domadian had gotten some program for calculating the design of these magnets from Brookhaven Lab, I think it was, and we settled on a design that was not a solenoid design. It was a Helmholtz coil kind of design, and we set about getting the wire. In those days, that special superconducting wire, was very, very expensive. And we never could have afforded doing it, except that Westinghouse Electric Company had they were getting out of the superconducting magnet business. They were in the business of manufacturing these magnets, and we in fact had bought a small magnet from them and did some initial imaging on a very small monkey with that. But they made a corporate decision to get out of manufacturing superconducting wire. They didn't really have it down pat, and there was some bad batches, and there was all kinds of. So they decided they had quite a bit of different size wire left that they were willing to donate to us and just take a tax write-off as a charity. Just give us all. So Larry Minkoff and I went down to Pennsylvania and to their lab and collected it all and brought it back in a truck. And then there was ultimately the magnet design we used required about 30 miles of wire put on the magnet. And
wow, 30 miles, that's a lot of
wire.
wire.
Well, we built a machine to wind it, sort of semi-automatically.
Yeah. Well, I remember your lab, going to your lab as a kid, and there were magnets everywhere. I mean, I suppose those were...
Well, that was already a corporate lab. That was already at the company we had set up. Yeah, there were magnets everywhere, right.
You told me not to play with them. Yeah, I still remember running with one, and I ran past a metal cabinet, and it just kind of went boom.
Right.
So,
Yeah, some of them were very strong magnets.
yeah. Huh. So, okay. So, I mean, did you ever have any doubts while you were doing all this work that this wasn't going to work out and you might have to go into some other business?
Well, I never had, there was never any certainty it would work out, but there was always another thing to try and another, you just keep fiddling with it and fiddling with it. And there was always some other, if some path didn't work, you'd think of some other thing to try and you would try it. And it might be promising, it might not be promising. You'd think of another thing to try. It was just trial and error for a long, long time. And it was very interesting and challenging because you had to self-teach, at least in my case, I never really took any formal training in electronics or a lot of the fields I was working with. And it was very interesting. I mean, you just did it until you became good at it.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. And I know that you spent a lot of sleepless nights and there was a lot of hard work involved. I mean, yeah, just.
Well, I mean, most of the sleep, many nights early on, this is before your mom and I got married, many nights when I was still single, I would sleep in the lab, sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even after we were married and when you were young, there were many times I'd be in the lab working till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. But, and in fact, your mom probably remembers that I would get up a lot of times if I'd come home even at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, go to sleep, I'd get up at 3 in the morning specifically to write some of these papers. And it was hard to get up, but it was the only time I had before I'd go back into the lab early morning. I'd usually go in around, have to leave around 7, so I'd get 3 or 4 hours of writing in the morning. And that was my habit during the week, during the work week. I'd get up around 3 to write and then go to work around 6:37, have breakfast before everybody would show up because I needed to make a to-do list of what to do during the day because if I didn't do that before 8 o'clock when all the technicians would show up and the phones would start ringing, I'd never get my thoughts organized of what I had to do that day. So I'd go in early, have some coffee and breakfast downstairs in the cafeteria, talk to some of the other people in the hospital there, and
Okay, and these papers, I mean, how were they helpful were they helpful for the company, Fonar, or for you personally, or both?
well, it was before most of them were done while we were at the university. It was necessary. It was helpful to get grant money from the government for much of the research. It was necessary for professional advancement. It was necessary to get the ideas out and promote interest in other scientific groups pursuing the same kind of research. So many of these papers were on issues of many of the papers I did were on studies on using magnetic resonance to determine whether in fact tissue was cancerous or not cancerous, and we published. We did a large study with at least 1,000 samples of cancers taken from different individuals, and published in a number, so in a number of different journals. So I had specific papers on breast cancer, on colon cancer, on lung cancer, because those were the 3 most prevalent forms of cancer, and.
Wow.
There were others. We did some collaboration. There was a woman who was attached to the obstetrics and gynecology department, so we did uterine cancers and things like that. And we published that paper with her. Um, it was an ongoing process.
Uh-huh. And are these papers still like available somewhere or archived in a library,
Well,
do you
yeah,
think?
they were published in different journals. They should still be available in most medical libraries. I mean, there would be, let's see, I don't remember honestly. It's so many years ago where everything was. A number of them were published in the journal, a journal called Cancer. There were some published in the British Journal of Cancer. There was some. I think the obstetrics one was in the British. Was in the. I think that was a British journal too of obstetrics and gynecology. But honestly, I don't remember off the top of my head all these or the names of all the different journals and stuff. And there were also some straight biophysics papers that had nothing to do with what we were doing that I had written earlier and published earlier. Nothing to do have nothing to do with MRI. That is.
Yeah.
They were more electrochemistry, like my PhD, like the thesis was.
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, would you say that your PhD, it had a lot of bearing on developing the MRI, or was it you went off?
It really had no bearing except very indirectly the way the thought process led to work on MRI. Early on in the work we were doing on bacteria and the electrochemical properties of bacterial membranes and so on, they were focused on the differences, why it was that human cells were very selective for potassium ions instead of sodium ions, when most of what's in the blood is sodium ions, and yet most of what's inside the cells are potassium ions. So somehow the cell is able to take potassium, even though it's much rarer in the body, inside it, in great preference to sodium. And our original work was on why that might be and how that process might work. But it led to the cancer and the MRI work indirectly through a series of steps, because it turns out the cancer cells had abnormal selectivity properties for sodium and potassium. So we started investigating that. And anyways, one thing's led to another over a number of years, that we wound up using magnetic resonance to study it. And then the radiant came up with the thought that, gee, wouldn't it be nice to be able to see these tumors right inside the body using this technique without having to cut them out of the person first.
Yeah, yep. That makes sense. Of course, I wasn't around for the days before the MRI, so I don't know. But yeah, cutting the tumors out sounds more gruesome than scanning. So, so I know that there were a few other teams working on similar things, and that eventually a Nobel Prize was awarded to some other team. So
in the end, there were three separate groups, two other groups besides ours, that were working on developing MRIs, and they used different techniques. Ours was the simplest, and the group that was closest in terms of competition with us was a group that geographically was not very far from us. They were out on Long Island in Stony Brook, and they were using a completely different technique. Neither our technique or their technique is in use any longer, because a third group in England, a few years later, just out of the blue, came up with a whole nother approach, a whole nother method, using the same basic science to make the images, MRI images. And that's the technique that's basically in use today. And that fellow, Mansfield, received the Nobel Prize for it quite deservedly. The competitive group with us out in Long Island shared that Nobel Prize with him. And the leader of our group, Damadian, did not. And that really is that really is an injustice, I think, because the mere fact that we were there, we came up with that first. In many ways, I think Dominion was really the spark plug behind these other groups applying what techniques they were working on to medicine.
Yeah.
And yet, because our technique was not in use, and because he's a physician, not a physicist, I think that that weighed, and maybe there's personality issues as well. That weighed a lot in the Nobel Committee's decision against including him. It really should have been a three-way split, that Nobel Prize. I'm sure it hurt him enormously, and it really was undeserved. He really deserved to share in that prize.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, but but he did end up having. Am I right about this? He had the patent, or he ended up.
Well, yes,
Yeah,
he had a patent which he assigned to the company we formed. He patented it early, like in the I think it was 1971, and that patent was assigned to the company we formed, and so they couldn't outright ignore his contribution because of the patent situation, and
Yeah, and the company is still in business, right?
the company's still in business,
Yeah.
a public company, yes.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So that's quite. I mean,
And eventually the company, when I was still there as vice president of the company, we initiated a lawsuit against what was then a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson called Technicon, that manufactured MRIs, and as for infringement on the patent. And eventually the company did win that suit against the successor company to Johnson & Johnson, because eventually Johnson & Johnson sold that business to GE, and the company did win the lawsuit ultimately.
But it took like 20 years or
yeah,
something.
it took a long time. It
Yeah.
wasn't until I don't know, 2005 or something like that, that they won that suit, that we started in 1980, something, maybe it was 1981. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, well, it looks like we're just about out of time here. Anyway, okay, well, thank you, everyone, and thanks for coming on the show, Dad. So, all right, I'll see you next week.